welcome. For those who were not here earlier, my name is Eda. I'm the programs manager here at Civio Institute, and welcome to our regional dialogue on nurturing accountability on policy implementation. This dialogue is part of an initiative and the culmination of a regional initiative that we've been running over the last 8 months, which has seen us broadening and expanding our policy tracker, our initial policy tracker, zimcitizenswatch.org, to now begin tracking policy performance, policy promise conversion in Zambia and Malawi. Thank you to everyone who's taken the time to be with us this morning. And we're hoping and looking forward to fruitful and engaging discussions throughout the morning. We hope that you'll be with us and we'll be together for the next 2.5 hours. We expect, if we keep on time, that will end by 11:30. Just to quickly give a background around Civio Institute, because there are a number of you or some of you who might not know about Civio Institute, as well as this initiative and why we have started it. As I said, our initiative that's led us to today's event, today's dialogue, is really around tracking government performance by looking at the extent to which they converge their policy promises that have been made in the run-up to elections. Just by way of background for us in this initiative, we do realize that the majority of countries in Southern Africa, we have mechanisms to hold regular elections. But successful elections, conclusion of elections, have not necessarily yielded or led to the achievement of socio-economic transformation or improved conditions of governance and justice. At the same time, office holders have not adequately delivered on electoral promises made. So basically, electoral forms of democracy have not yet yielded broader social and economic benefits for the majority. And in the process, a number of citizens have there's a growing number of citizens who have lost confidence and trust in governance. There's limited interest in voter registration, and rather citizens, especially the youth, have resorted to engaging in public protests and migration. There have been very few mechanisms to enhance accountability of office holders in their terms of office. And civil society organizations in the advocacy space are also limited by not having adequate tools to track on implementation of policy promises. So our attempt or our initiative in developing what we are now calling the African Citizens Watch.org platform is around then providing a tool or a mechanism to support civil society and citizens to track the implementation of policy promises and to push for greater and increased accountability and transparency by their governments. We realize that the true work of democracy really starts the day after elections. What then happens? How then are citizens able to hold governments to account, to then engage on issues where they feel that the government is lacking behind? What tools are therefore in place to help support this? And as I said, our African Citizens Watch.org platform is such a tool that we have developed. And at this stage, we are tracking 3 African countries, which are namely Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. And just as I said, for those who might not know who Civio Institute is, Civio Institute, we're a think tank based in Zimbabwe, but undertaking regional and continental work. And our focus really is on ensuring that citizens are at the center of processes of socio-economic and policy change. And ultimately, our aim is to contribute towards Africa's inclusive political and socio-economic transformation. And we do this by focusing on 3 areas, which are civic engagement, philanthropy and communities, entrepreneurship and financial inclusion. And we do this through a number of means, such as research and knowledge generation, advocacy, networking, capacity support, dialogues and convenings, and the development of integrated technology platforms, such as our AfricanCitizensWatch.org platform. At the core of everything that we do are citizens, and enhancing then how citizens then engage with the state and towards advancing democracy and development. And through it all, we always seek to leverage technology and use digital media in our work. So in this case, our leveraging of technology is the development of this online platform to help then track the policy, conversion, performance of the governments of South Africa, of Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. So for those who had a chance to just glimpse at our program, our initial program had us going next into just a quick discussion to just set the context around civil society and government accountability. But our speaker is running just a little bit late. So what we'll do is move on to the next section of our program, which just talks about the tracking approach, kind of giving a history of other attempts or, and other processes in place at tracking the performance of governments or presidents. And then we'll take a deep dive into our tracking platform, AfricanCitizensWatch.org, to then kind of see and look at a few questions or issues. What do we track? How do we track? And what's the methodology around it? And just then give a brief background or introduction to the platform. As we're having these discussions, or as we're going through our program, I would also then encourage you at some point in time to also then make use of the chat function. Please feel free to introduce yourself and the organization that you're with. And then also please feel free to then share any comments or questions as the program progresses, as we get into our presentation and discussions. And the team will make note of those. And then we'll have a time, two times, we will have a question and answer or discussion period. And we'll then look to address either those comments, those questions that are raised. So as I said, please feel free to make use of the chat function to also introduce yourself and maybe the organization that you're with and the country that you're from. Today, we're expecting a wide range of participants from Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, together with other individuals from across the continent who have shown interest in and have been interested in the policy tracker that we've developed. So I'll just quickly talk about the tracker approach. And then if you just allow me just a few seconds to just share my screen for a short presentation that I have. All right, great. If you can just acknowledge either with a thumbs up or you can unmute if you can see my screen.
Yes, I can see it.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for the thumbs up as well. So.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great, thank you. policy tracking or promise tracking, I think it's a growing phenomenon. And one of the things that has made it possible is technological advancement. The trackers that we're seeing are ones that are wholly online. And because of the amount of information that it's supposed to hold, that it's supposed to provide, having it as an online platform is the easiest way in which to, I think, manage and allow for the ease of access of information. Ultimately, these trackers become repositories or one-stop shops for information. And the aim often is to support greater civic engagement and decision making. And then essentially these platforms seek to provide evidence as to whether politicians really can keep the promises they make. So as I alluded to earlier, and just in the short prelude when we started, that, you know, oftentimes it's not clear, or, you know, what is the extent that the promises that are made during electoral rallies, campaigns, are then actually converted into tangible actions and those promises fulfilled. And really, this is what our platform or policy tracking platforms seek to do. At the same time, as I said, it allows just for ease of access of information. As I run through some of the examples of policy trackers that are currently in place or have been in place, you'll see that, you know, the promises that are being tracked at times often exceed the hundreds. And in each instance, evidence is being provided that tangible actions have either been taken to fulfill those promises, or in some ways, the actions that have been taken have been contrary to the promise and have resulted in broken actions and it resulted in broken promises. So kind of like the first one, or the first example that of a policy tracker or policy trackers that are out there is the Polimeter, which tracks the performance of the Canadian Prime Minister and then the premiers of 3 kind of key provinces or states that they have. It provides historical tracking, and it also shows the performance of those who have left office. So in this instance of the Polimeter, it again shows the number of days that the Prime Minister has been in office, and then they've categorized the implementation of those promises around not yet rated, in progress, kept, partially kept, and broken. And then for each of those promises, they give evidence or information as to how they've arrived at that categorization of a promise. Then I'll just touch on PolityFacts. So PolityFacts is a claim and fact-checking website based out of, published by the Tampa Bay Times. So this is one that has come out of the media space. And they've primarily been tracking the performance of American presidents. So initially starting with President Obama, they had the Obama meter, which showed that at the end of his term, he had kept 48% of his promises, 28% of the promises were part of a compromise, and he broke 24% of them. Then they also, when President Trump came into power, they also created the Trump-O-meter, which then tracked the 100 promises that he made during his 2016 campaign. And then at the end of his term, he had kept 23% of his promises and broken 53% of them. And they felt that he had compromised on 22% of the promises that he made. So currently they're monitoring President Biden's performance. They're monitoring his 100 most important campaigns. So as of today, they feel that he's been able to keep 22% of his promises. He's stalled or not made enough progress on 28%, and he's broken only 1% of his promises so far. So this is almost literally at the halfway stage of his term of office. It's also not a Western phenomenon. There's also been the Rouhani meter, which ironically has come out of Iran, but really has been Iran's first and only tracking meter. So this was created after President Rouhani's victorious 2013 election campaign, and covered his performance or showed his performance at the end of his 8-year term. So he had 2 terms of office. And at the end of those 8 years, he had only achieved 8 of his promises, and 72 had not been achieved. But as I said, so it's interesting that, we'd think that something like this really maybe might be pushed or done by a democracy, but we see a country like Iran, as I said, even though it's been their only tracking meter, but an attempt has been made to try and track the performance of their president. And then coming down to Africa, we have a number of examples or attempts again at promise tracking. So we have one by Africa Check, which tracks 10 key promises made by governments in Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. These were issues that were noted as the most important, the things that mattered the most, just Kenyans, Nigerians, and South Africans. And then they selected 29 of those to then assess their progress. So it's just a select few. It's not, all the complete promises of for Kenya or for South Africa or for Nigeria, but just a select few. Nigeria has also in itself also attempted to have tracking. The Center for Development and Democracy developed the Buhari meter, which has been tracking President Buhari's performance since he was elected in 2015. There was a website and has been a website created for it, but unfortunately it's down at the moment. But they have, they've attempted, I think, to try and then promote, as the poster says here, to promote democratic accountability by then tracking and assessing his performance. In North Africa, in Egypt, we see the Morsi meter. So this was tracking the performance of President Morsi from his presidency, his short presidency, which was just over a year, and the progress that was made. From that, they have been consistent, a little bit consistent, and now President Sisi his performance is also being tracked through the Sisi meter. As of today, they've said that, he's been in power for 3,074 days. His term of office will end on the 2nd of June, 2024. 20% of his promises are being fulfilled, or the actions that have been implemented are working towards them being fulfilled, and 30%, according to this tracker, of his promises have come true. So I think what these examples highlight is that this is not attempts at policy tracking. It's not a new phenomenon. It's something that has been attempted, and attempted in different spaces. We saw examples from North America. We've seen examples from Middle East, and then examples here from West, North, East, and even Southern Africa. And for us as the Viewer Institute, really, is to draw upon the lessons learned or the good experiences or the best practices coming out from those tracking efforts, to do something that's one quite consistent.
Okay, and the person administering the punishment,
that we look then to continue to, to enhance. How do we keep it consistent as well? We saw in the case of Iran that since President Rouhani has left power, there's been no attempt to continue with the tracking initiatives, with under the current president. And it's the same. We're seeing some, similar kind of things happening across the continent as well. The Buhari meter, yes, it was launched, it was started, but again, it's just then the consistency in ensuring that, because it's an online platform, how is that information continuously made available and continuously being updated to give citizens, to give civil society up-to-date information, and to then enhance and be able to ensure that governments are being held accountable. So, yeah, as I said, instances of this are not new. Our aim, as we begin to talk more and explain more about the African Citizens Watch, is really then to ensure that there is one continued consistency in the tracking, from one government to the next, and that information is always available. To then push to ensure that these tracking processes do not just become, the tracking processes are something that are continuous, that the information is available, and that it's also archived so people can have a track record and see the performance across multiple years or multiple terms, in terms of how political parties or how presidents have done, in the process. So, as I said, that's just briefly just talking about the tracking approach and the history around it, and just giving, as I said, a couple of examples on the continent and across the globe of efforts and attempts at tracking policy, promise performance. So I don't know if at this stage I'm just checking the chat box to see if there's any questions or comments. I think mostly it's just introductions so far. But if not, I think we can revert back to our program and our initial, I see our Executive Director, Dr. Murisa, has now joined us. Welcome, Tendai. And maybe we can hand over to you to talk more about civil society and government accountability before we go and provide a little bit more detail and information around the African Citizens Watch platform, what we're tracking and how we do the tracking. Okay, let us just wait while he gets a little bit settled. I think he's still getting his audio set up. Okay. Sorry. So our speaker is just having a few technical issues. We're just going to, I think we can move on just to our next section whilst we're getting him sorted out. So as indicated, we have these examples of various tracking platforms, but we'll now take a little bit of a deep dive into our African Citizens Watch platform, and just give a brief overview of what it does. And I think it will also begin to kind of highlight maybe some of the commonalities that we've drawn from the other trackers that we've seen or developed across the continent and across the world, but also then what kind of other enhancements have we been able to put in as Savio Institute in our attempt to leverage technology. Okay, so I will just share my screen again. And Matron, if you can just confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes.
All right, great. So I think the African Citizens Watch Tracker, what is it? Like the other trackers that we've seen, what it is a real-time policy tracker, and it's an independent platform run by civil society organizations on behalf of citizens. So as I said, currently it's tracking the performance across 3 countries, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So I think maybe one of the key things or critical things where what makes this platform unique is that we're trying to do multi-country tracking, and it's full-on tracking of all their policy promises. The one that we saw earlier for Africa Check is really concentrated on 3 countries, and then it's only a few select what they consider to be the most important policy issues for citizens that they're tracking. But our aim as African Citizens Watch is that we're tracking all policy actions and policy promises of these 3 African countries, of the incumbent political parties of their governments. And then, so how does this tracking happen? The tracking happens by tracking policy manifestos and any major significant policy pronouncements post-inauguration. So the policy manifestos are really the starting ground for us in which promises are then going to be tracked. And thereafter, in the term of office of the government or the political party, they might make some significant pronouncements post-inauguration, and those can then be added to the tracker. And the reason why we tracking using the policy manifestos is really that we want it to be a starting point of tracking what it was that governments or political parties have promised themselves. We understand that at times political parties or governments are subject to or sign up to maybe international agreements or arrangements through continental bodies, to bodies like the United Nations. And at times, their argument is that some of the things that they're trying to implement are things that maybe that are considered best practice, but they didn't come up with the necessary promise or action. But with the policy manifestos or party manifestos, the important thing is that this is what they are making as promises. So for us, we feel that that's important to then track, to hold them to account to what it is that they promised, and what they maybe continue to promise even post-inauguration. We start the policy tracking from the day that the new president or government is inaugurated. So in this instance, with the map or the picture that's shown there, this was at the end of September. In the case of Zimbabwe, the president at that time had been inaugurated for 1,087 days. In the case of Zambia, the president had been in place for 392 days, so just over a year. And in Malawi, for 814 days. So in Malawi, the president and the party has been in place, government has been in place for just over 2 years. The tracking looks at 5 thematic areas, so economy, governance, corruption, climate change, and social services. We cluster it like this so that it's then also to do some cross-country analysis to then see how governments across the different countries that we are tracking and will expand on the platform to continue to track, how do they perform against each other. But then we also realize that these are also like the key kind of sectors, thematic areas that the policy manifestos are built around. Economy generally tends to have the highest number of policy actions and promises. I think given the context and state of where the African continent is, and for many countries, the improvement growth of the economy really is something then that's a major issue of concern for citizens, and governments, political parties have recognized this. So when you have a chance to go onto the platform and to look through it, you'll see that, as I said, economy generally tends to have the majority of the promises in it. Followed then by governance, usually then social services, climate change, and lastly by corruption. So with the tracking, there is different categorization then of promises based on the actions that have been made. It's something that we saw even across the different platforms that I shared. Some of the terminology is a little bit different. For us, this is what we felt, I think, was the best way maybe to then represent and to give clarity as to the extent to which promises have been met or not met by governments. So the first one that we have is implemented. These are promises that have been acted on and fully completed. Then we have promises that are in progress. So actions that government has commenced and is in the process of achieving. The thought process then is that because at times some policy actions do take time, those that are in progress by the end of the 5-year term, they will shift to being implemented. We have promises that are not then categorized as not commenced. So these are promises that where actions have not started. And at the end of the tracking cycle, they will be classified as unaccomplished. So in the case of Zimbabwe, where next year in 2023, when we have finished tracking for this initial 5-year term, anything that's not commenced will then be converted to become an unaccomplished promise. We then have modified which of those commitments which have changed or modified due to some changes or circumstances that have required government to then maybe make a shift or policy shift or a policy change. Then finally, and often the most controversial, are the broken promises. So these are promises that government would either not have made any action towards achieving, or they have done actions that are contradictory to the stated promise. So for example, one that President Rouhani, the Rouhani meter had, which was that Iran would become more transparent or open around their nuclear program. And that was given as broken by the end of his term because that didn't happen. Instead, the actions that they put in place were actually contradictory towards that promise and went against that promise. Instead of becoming more open, the situation, they became more closed in terms of what it is that they were doing with their nuclear program. So just looking at the tracker itself, once you're on it, when you delve deeper into each country, you'll get a summary of the promises, and then you'll be able then to view each of the various thematic areas of the promises. So as I said, so by economy, governance, corruption, climate change, social services, there are tabs that if you click on, it'll then open up and give you just summary data around the status of all the economy promises or all the governance promises. So in this case, this was for Malawi, and economy constitutes 45% of the promises, the total promises made, and only 4% of these promises had been completed to date. If you want to then get more details on the promises under each thematic area, there's an explore button on the left-hand corner that you'll then click on, and it will then give you a deep dive into all the promises for economy and then the actions that have been taken. So again, once you click on economy and explore data, you'll get to then see initially a summary of the performance just of the economic promises. In this case, there are 143 promises. This is for Zambia, 65 were kept, 76 were not commenced, and 1 was implemented. This was at the end of September. And then you'll be able to click on it and click on the different updates. So updates are then put in the order of the latest update that has been provided, and you'll be able to then find more information. So within the tracker, if you click on each of the promises, you can then click on an individual promise and it will show you their status and the promise history. So the promise history is essentially the actions that have been made towards fulfilling that promise. How do we keep the data, the tracker updated? As I said, this is a real-time tracker. So for us, the data collection is really based on news articles, reports of specific actions that have been done related to the manifesto promises. So these actions, the key thing is that whether it's newspaper articles, it's government reports, it could be reports by civil society, it could be reports by international bilateral agencies around something that has been spearheaded by government or the responsible line ministry. That's the key thing, is that government really there must be clear evidence that government has spearheaded this action or this initiative towards fulfilling a specific manifesto promise. The actions from the newspaper articles, we record on an Excel sheet, which is then used then to upload and update the back end of our tracker. Across the 3 countries, we also always ensure that the actions are reviewed and verified, and for this authenticity. So we always make sure that we ensure that the actions that we then update or use as evidence that a promise is being met are authenticated, and that they are verified. So for us, we've started this, or we have this platform in place. And initially, and now we're tracking these 3 countries consistently. So our aim is that we continue with the tracking for Zambia for the next 4 years, for Malawi for the next 3 years, and for just under a year for Zimbabwe. It's called African Citizens Watch Tracker. So the aim is to continue to add other countries. We've seen elections in Kenya, we've seen elections in Angola, we've seen elections that have just happened now in Lesotho as well. So these are the countries that we then hope will be able to add onto the platform. And the continued promotion of this tool. The tool is, as we said, for civil society, for citizens, for actors in the space who are trying to increase and promote improved accountability of governments, so we want to then make it a go-to advocacy tool to promote government accountability, transparency, and engagement around public processes. So that's basically it about the African Citizens Watch platform. This is from us, but we'll get a chance when we delve down a little bit deeper into the 3 countries that we're currently tracking to just find out a bit more about, the process of accountability, but how this tool or this platform is starting or can start to help in the improvement of accountability on the part of government in those 3 countries. Okay, so I'll just take a moment to just check our chat box. I don't know, Matron, Leon, have there been any questions that have come through in the chat? Questions or comments?
No, Etta, we do not have any comments in the chat box yet.
Okay, that's fine. Sure, they will still come, and as we continue with the discussions that people will have or be able to provide some comments or questions, and they're welcome to use the chat box to do that. So we're just going to go back a little bit in our program, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Tendai Mrisa, our Executive Director, to I think give insights and share just a little bit more about civil society and government accountability. As I said, the tool, the platform, and this tracking process really is to support the work of civil society organizations and to help support their work and their advocacy around improved transparency and accountability within public processes. So good morning, Tendai, and over to you.
Thanks. Let's proceed with the program. I'll come in later towards the end I think it's only easier because otherwise this meeting will be about Civil. We just had Civil presentation. So let's invite the panel. I think there's a panel. Let's do the panel. Then towards the end, we'll talk about civil society and accountability.
All right, that's fine. I think we can go ahead and do that. So we have a panel to discuss with us and just share with us a contextual analysis of how accountability looks like in the 3 countries that we're tracking. So that's Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So on our panel are Luchembe Chilufu, who's from Zambia and is the Executive Director for the Alliance for Accountability Advocates. We have Suzgo Chitete, who is from the National Publications Limited in Malawi, and kind of like in the media space, but will be able to offer, I think, a great contextual analysis from that angle around accountability in Malawi. And then we have John Maketo, who's the programs manager from SimCode, to speak about Zimbabwe. So how the panel is going to work, there are a couple of guiding questions, which I think I'll put forward to the panel to take a chance or to provide a platform and an opportunity for them to share. But I think maybe in the first round, starting maybe with you, Suzgo, maybe we'll start with you. We'll go in alphabetical order. Can you just give us just a short contextual, background and analysis? What does government accountability look like in Malawi at the moment? To what extent is government, or does government is it accountable? Does it provide information, insights, and the progress that it's making towards fulfilling the promises that were made during elections?
Thank you so much for that particular question. So, like you indicated, I'm Suzgo Chitete. I work as a journalist in Malawi, and governance and accountability is my area of interest, more out of passion. And getting down to your question, how accountability looks like in Malawi, I would say it's a timely question, especially now when we have a new government in place, which is almost 2 years old. And this is a government that campaigned to improve the rule of law, and they also promised to be more accountable and transparent in their undertakings. But along the way, there are also citizens' questions in terms of accountability. The first thing that comes into my mind is how this government, the new government, has failed to disclose what was contained in their agreement, because it's a government formed out of an alliance of several parties. So they kept the people in the dark. It took the vice president also out of frustration, because apparently it had fallen out of the grace for him to reveal the contents of the alliance agreement, which were also contested by the other main partner in the alliance, which is also the ruling party, the Malawi Congress Party. So people have been left in the dark as to what was agreed under an alliance formed with the support of the people themselves. So this is why I'm saying your question is coming at an appropriate time. Again, there are several issues to do with how government is managing money. There is one big program that government runs. It's an agriculture subsidy called Affordable Input Program, which consumes over 65% of the agriculture budget. And agriculture is the mainstay for Malawi's economy. So this is how important the program is. So as we are talking, usually every year at a time like this one, the government will have started distributing the inputs to the targeted farmers who amount in millions. But this year, it appears government is not at the same level. It's behind time. There's scant information whether government has got fertilizer, and what has come out also after some social media speculations as well as press reports is that government was duped of $720,000 US to some agents who posed to represent firms from the UK. And again, that's one of the development that that the media and the public are keenly following up. So, well, I've begun from the negative, but I think things are not rosy. The only difference between this government and governments before is that they all enjoy a culture of secrecy where information is not easily given to the public. It has to take an investigative journalist or indeed some social media influencer to get information, post on Facebook, and then put up the pressure, or the civil society themselves to put up the pressure for government to make the information available. But there is no proactive accountability or proactive mechanisms to make public undertakings more transparent. And lastly, I'm providing an overview. There's still light at the end of the tunnel. So after so many years, Malawi has the Access to Information Act of 2017, and the regulations also came into effect about 2 years ago. So we have an enabling law. But the problem remains. There's not enough awareness such that those that have attempted to make use of the law itself have been frustrated. I'm a living example of people who have been frustrated by the Access to Information regulations. Still, government officials are not forthcoming giving information. Neither are there consequences for those that do not comply with this particular provision. What is good and positive is that we have a vibrant civil society, and there is active citizen engagement and participation in public affairs, which is forcing government to come out of the cocoon and account for its actions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the that you've highlighted. And as we related to policy tracking is the need for access to information. This culture of secrecy or limited proactive mechanisms for information to be released does make things difficult. Luchemba, I don't know, whether some of the things that have been touched on, are there similar experiences that you see in Zambia, or is it a little bit of a different story there? What is the situation like in Zambia?
Thank you, Eda. Quite similar situations, but of course, I think when it comes to issues to do with accountability, there is no government that will be as transparent as civil society would want them to be, or as citizens would want them to be. So in the Zambian context, accountability is now being accepted as a word that government can entertain. I think from the past governments, when you talk about accountability, it was like you're talking about checking someone's pocket, how they are spending their money, and sometimes even confusing it from public resources and personal resources. So currently, there is hope that indeed issues of accountability will be accepted or be heard by government, but we still have quite a number of challenges. We were very hopeful that, of course, with a new government in place, for example, the Act on Information, providing information to the public, could be passed very quickly, but this is still something that is being in the progress for quite some time. So the Information Act bill is still being, submissions are still being taken here and there. we thought that this would be provided quickly so that people would have easy access to information. But we do have opportunities to hold government accountable in the sense that every year we have the Auditor General's report, which comes out highlighting some of the corrupt practices, some of the information that people would not have had access during the time maybe procurement processes were being done and the like. Unfortunate when this report comes out, when you talk about holding government accountable and holding offices accountable, you find that there isn't much that is done apart from just, civil society talking about issues that have been highlighted in the report. And sometimes, even when people have been found wanting, there is no persecution being done. You find someone has been taken to court in a few weeks or in a few months' time, the case will come to an end without anyone being persecuted. So there is indeed a need to ensure that issues of accountability are upheld, even in Zambia. Issues of secrecy, yes, there is a lot of issues that are done behind back doors, and later on you come to hear about maybe a business or a procurement process that was done and it was maybe not done correctly. So there is a lot of room for improvement when it comes to issues of accountability, even in Zambia. Of course, there is hope where we have, for example, government trying to engage citizens or Zambians to be able to be part and parcel from the planning processes, from the implementation aspect and monitoring aspect. But I think there are still challenges, even where people are not, sometimes fully engaged because of lack of information, or information is not reaching the communities easily for them to participate at planning level and even at implementation level. I say this because most of the time when you see, for example, a project is being implemented in a community, information should be provided. A billboard of information should be provided where specific information is given. For example, who the contractor is, how much is involved, when the project will be completed, and all that information. But in most cases, when you go in our communities and you find government project being implemented, such information is not provided, and people only come to learn about some of the projects after maybe wrong things have been done, money has been misappropriated or misapplied, and it's difficult to hold government to account when decisions have been made, when wrong procedures have been engaged. It's important that citizens get to be involved from the start, so that the monitoring, holding a government accountable is done as things are done. So these are things that needs to be improved, and I think issues of accountability in Southern Africa, I would say we are kind of waking up now and trying to empower citizens to know that they have a right to hold government accountable, to talk about issues and how they are being done, and so forth. I think in the past governments, this was something that you would not easily do, even as an institution that is talking about issues of accountability, you'd be looked at as an anti-government, because you are always trying to bring out the other side of government, especially where things are not being done properly. But with maybe the new government in place, we hope that these are issues that we'll be able to discuss openly. And so far, since the government has been in power for 1 year and a few months now, we're seeing hope of engagement and promoting issues of accountability, but there's still room for improvement. There's still areas that needs to ensure that people are fully involved, citizens are fully involved in holding government accountable. And it's good that we are partnering with Civio to bring in, for example, the tracker, which we'll definitely be able to talk about as we continue this discussion. And these are very important tools that citizens need to be able to know what did government commit to, how should we hold them accountable, how do we engage with government and duty bearers. And in most cases, when we talk about government, sometimes we confuse it to only one person who we want to hold accountable. And in this case, it's only the president. We forget that there are a lot of people that need to be held accountable, especially the duty bearers, those that have been in office. Even when governments are changing, certain people do not change in these offices. They still remain there, and we don't hold them accountable to the actions and the influence they have even to these politicians that come into political offices. So there is need for us to, I think, continue building capacity, continue engaging for people to really be able to come out and hold our governments accountable.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Luchembe, for those insights. So just to continue with the panel and take our discussion forward, I'm going to now hand over to my colleague, Belinda Chaura, who is one of our center coordinators. And she's going to take us through just the remainder of the panel discussion and our remaining session for today. Over to you, Belinda.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Eda, and good morning to everybody. As Eda has indicated, I am a member of the team at Civio Institute. So I'm just going to take the discussion forward. And I think we've heard some great insights already. But right now I want to bring up John Maketo from ZimCode. John, I hope you've got your contributions ready. And you can give us your version of a contextual analysis on what accountability looks like. I think you are focusing on Zimbabwe. So John, I'm going to ask you to unmute your microphone and share your video. And after John comes on, we're going to then take questions from the floor. We've got some that have been posted in the chat, but if you do have a question, you can get it ready then. John, are you present?
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity, Belinda, and happy to connect with you all colleagues, and I want to acknowledge earlier presenters highlighting the overview of accountability in both Malawi and Zambia. And I just also want to highlight that there's a lot of similarities around the contextual outlook in our different countries. So in Zimbabwe, it's equally the same. I think the first and the most important thing to highlight is that accountability is not given in a platter. It's something that, from my analysis, will have to be followed up. It has to be demanded. I'm not sure in other jurisdictions, but the trend and the experience we have this side is that governments are not in a position to voluntarily just be accountable. If ever they are, then it's serving them a good purpose. So that drives us to the point that I think there is evidence that there is a need to raise the stakes for not being accountability in order to make governments accountable. Like colleagues from Zambia and Malawi as well, access to information is a key challenge in Zimbabwe. Yes, you have legislative provision for access to information. The Freedom of Information Act recently passed, but really it has not been put to test. For example, it's difficult to get information around the disclosure or beneficial owners of specific companies that are dealing with government, just as an example. And you also find that even the Office of the Auditor General struggles to get specific information for audit purposes, and even government offices, they are highly inaccessible to the general citizenry. The procedures to get access to information highly demanding, even for purposes of research, academic purposes, and so forth. You find that the amount of paperwork required from you, the up and down that they will require from you, and the slow turnaround time is just so frustrating and discouraging. Worse off for journalists, it's just frustrating to the extent that people just give up. And what this leads on to is the generation of shadow reports or citizen versions of governance information. And so you find that as much as we are doing tracking, our tracking is credible as the information that is inputted into these tracking systems. Then equally, I wanted to also highlight that in our work with Parliament has also expressed the challenges around access to information and the accountability systems within various government departments. Public Accounts Committee, the Budget Committee, struggling to get the Ministry of Finance, for example, to come and give granular details around a budget expenditure and so forth. We are currently seized with the issue of special drawing rights resources in Zimbabwe and how these have been drawn down and expended. So far, it's just a mammoth task to get such detail to the public. And we have had also precedents around COVID-19 pandemic and also previous disasters that hit us, like during the time of Cyclone Idai. Audit reports have exposed that there was a lot of maladministration in how government expended public funds in responding to those emergency situations. And just want to also highlight that for the first time, I think we have had government voluntarily being audited for special audits for those emergency funds, and which is probably a positive step in the right direction. And so yes, a push towards access to information and demand for accountability has led to a number of key issues and challenges, including persecution, backlash, political labeling, is part of the package that you get for demanding accountability and exposing the lack of accountability thereof on the part of government. So largely we have a lot to do in terms of getting to the desired level for accountability and transparency in our governance system, both at the central level and also even in local governments. It's still a mammoth task to get access to credible information around budget expenditure and how natural resources and other public resources are actually managed in Zimbabwe. So this is maybe in an overview way how it stands in Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John, for your contribution. I think what I took out there is a key point that you made, that accountability has to be demanded, and that governments won't voluntarily account unless we put a demand on accountability for them. So I appreciate your contribution, John. So I'm going to open us up for questions, open the floor to the people who are present in the event room. And just to go through some of the comments that have come already. Simbarashe said he's following. Thank you so much. Elliot Mendoza, Pastor Elliot, thank you. You're present in many of our events and we appreciate that. He says, thank you for sharing and unpacking this tool. And he's saying, what is the common trend, if any, of the most kept and most broken promises by the sector, especially in the African space? Maybe if somebody wants to answer that question. And then Staffiel says, how do we account for the emerging issues of climate change, COVID-19, and a lack of unified manifesto in the case of Malawi in terms of policy tracking? We'll take those two questions first, and then we'll move on to other contributions. Not sure who I can hand over to. Or would anyone like to volunteer?
Okay, thanks, Belinda. I can attempt maybe one around civic engagement in policy tracking issues, considering economic factors in the African countries, particularly Zimbabwe. So civic engagement in policy tracking has been very slow, particularly in Zimbabwean context, for 2 or 3 reasons. Number one is around the fear factor. The fear factor. Citizens have been intimidated, and the question of accountability is also has been for a long time considered a taboo. In fact, it's also embedded in our culture. Our culture, which is largely patriarchal and also exhibits ageism, to the extent that it's a taboo for young people to ask their elders about how things have been managed. Even in the home setup, you find out that it is very rare. We don't have that culture for children to ask their father, to ask their parents, how have you spent it, on these resources? Why haven't our fees been paid? So it's a culture, a practice that is embedded in our culture. We are trained, we are groomed to be quiet, we are groomed to not to ask critical questions. It's actually considered rude. Where we are reaching with it.
Sorry about that, you can continue.
All right, thank you. So I was just saying that it's actually considered rude in a way to ask critical questions to your elders. And you find that this practice and culture then it overlaps into our communities. It's widely accepted in even at the grant level, at nation at large. Asking your governor, asking your member of parliament about questions of accountability, you are considered an outlier. You are considered you are rude. You are considered to be almost a rebel. So this is what makes civic engagement in the question of accountability and the policy tracking very difficult for a start, because also of the backlash which I earlier on talked about in terms of and the political labeling, persecution that follows that, which is largely embedded in our society. And at another layer, you also find that the level of economic literacy is very low in most of our communities, to the extent that one cannot track policies that they have not understood, that have not been broken down to them. They cannot even track deliverables that they've not clearly understood or that have not been clearly stated down with clear targets in granular details. So even our budgets, you find that they are presented in this broad and almost ambiguous state, to the extent that even to track them. And I'll give you an example of the National Development Strategy 1. They are so ambiguous, broad steps that are just stated in there. And so for you to be able to track those policies, unless you are an economist or an informed and you are following economic policies with some passion, it's very difficult for you to follow through. And most of our citizens find themselves in that scenario. The level of economic literacy is actually very low. But just to also acknowledge the work of civil society organizations around improving economic literacy and engaging the citizens and working with Parliament to impress the need to engage, to consult citizens towards inclusive policies and ensure that the policies themselves are people-centered. Yes, we have seen some strides, but there's still a lot that needs to be done. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, John, for that. I'm going to invite Suzgo to talk about the question that was raised about the lack of a unified manifesto in the case of Malawi. So Stafio was asking, how do we account for the emerging issues of climate change, COVID-19, and the lack of a unified manifesto in the case of Malawi? Would you be able to tackle that?
Thank you so much. So the lack of a unified manifesto in Malawi is a problem that we have acknowledged. If we only had one party into power, of course we know the Malawi Congress Party legally is the ruling party by law, because their candidate is the one who presented the nomination papers to the Malawi Electoral Commission. So we've been tracking some of the progress based on what is contained in the Malawi Congress Party manifesto. But what we also do, we have isolated those popular issues that were promised during campaign, and we hold the president accountable, we hold the leadership accountable based on what was promised. For example, he promised that he would reduce presidential powers. His understanding was that the president wields a lot of power, and therefore that makes him untouchable or away from the citizen. So that is the one thing that we have also been pushing. For example, so during the campaign time, they promised to make the Anti-Corruption Bureau independent, and through the coordinated voice of the civil society, journalists, this is one of the things that government has also been able to achieve because they promised. So the manifesto may not, the joint manifesto, unified manifesto may not easily be available in the public. They may have kept it under wraps, leaving everybody to guess because they don't want to account for their promises. But at least we know a large number of things that they promised. And sometimes because they're in an alliance, we go to individual manifestos to see how government is faring. So where I work, Nation Publications Limited has previously, had stories where we look at what they promised and how much they've been able to fulfill. And this we have done, I think, the first year of this government, and we also did it, the second, the second anniversary. The other question is on COVID-19, quite an interesting question. Personally, as an investigative journalist, I think I've done some stories on how COVID funds were abused. So we have a leadership that would only act if somebody has provided that kind of information. So even if they know, they may not act. But when there is a story or there is that push from social media influencers who have become so popular in Malawi, you'd actually see the president acting. So in the context of COVID-19, I remember we had a story where we spoke about a feast. So 780 million COVID feast was a story that exposed how government officials, who included ministers, members of parliament, members of the academia who were in the task force, were pocketing huge allowances in the name of professional allowance. At a time, Malawi was literally begging for funds from outside to help it cope with COVID-19. And I was also personal to do some stories that tracked the funding that was coming from donors, and also looked at how Malawi was struggling to provide the basics. For example, you'd go to a hospital where there would be no oxygen, yet funds in millions of dollars were actually given to Malawi from different partners. So that kind of journalism, which is in form of activism, was also able, to ignite that kind of pressure from the public to demand accountability. And indeed, it was that time when we saw the president also acting. He suspended some of the people that were involved in the malpractice. I remember one of the ministers who had used COVID funds to go for a workshop in South Africa, was actually dismissed at that particular time. It was all about bringing information to him, and then the public, begin to push. So the president, the current leadership, would not want to be seen to be a failure, especially where people are pushing. I also know of my own story again, just as an example, where one of the presidential aides and some parliamentarians from the government side, the ministers, smuggled a bill into parliament. So how this bill got into parliament, no one knows, because cabinet never discussed it. The attorney general never knew about it. So it never followed the normal procedure, but it found itself on the order paper, and this was 98 million euros that would have been approved by Parliament without really knowing where this bill is actually coming from. And this is not the first time. We have had cases where sometimes bills are passed without anybody knowing. So until we wrote that particular story, there was pressure from the president. A few people were arrested, and the president had to dismiss one of his own top advisor because he was involved in the smuggling of the bill. But the story in itself was not enough. It took the public pressure, and that is what we actually see, that the action, that there is always action when the public are pushing for something. So there could be a possible wrongdoing, but until there is that pressure. And I must mention that, yes, we have a vibrant social civil society in Malawi, but I think the trust is kind of declining. There's more trust in the media and social media influencers, people that, would post on Facebook and they have huge following. From my rough, in the last 2 years, we have seen the president dismissing 4 cabinet ministers on fraud-related issues. And this is as a result of media reports as well as the push from the public. So that is the good thing that I can say, from Malawi, that active citizen engagement is really becoming so crucial, leading to action. Talking about climate change as another issue, I know now there are several activities that are happening around the country. There are also questions of accountability. Deliberately from our end as a newspaper, we usually we have made climate change as one of our focal points, looking at the catastrophic effects it has to Malawi. So what we are doing now is also to track funding that goes into climate change adaptation and mitigation programs, and what Malawi is generally doing within and also in collaboration with other countries. My very last point, which also relates to what has been said in Zambia and Zimbabwe, is that our government, the positive side is that it has learned to hide information in plain view. So the National Audit Office is one office that would give out reports now and again. So every year we have these reports posted on the website. They're in English. It will take someone to get that report, translate to the people, for the people to understand. The same thing about public procurement. So you go on the website of the Public Procurement Authority, you find everything there, but it must take someone to translate that knowledge to the larger population that do not understand English. So this is why, personally, I've given myself an extra task. So beyond being an investigative journalist, I am also a founder of a theater group we call WAS Arts Theater. Really, it's arts for social change. So we are getting some of the information that I get from my previous position as a journalist, and we translate that into theater so that we give information to people to understand. And one of our plays is quite hard hitting. Government doesn't like it. We really had trouble to get even permission from the censorship board to perform it in the cities, because it's talking about the current corruption that is happening, the lack of inaction, and also we are looking at accountability, not just on the executive part, but from top to the bottom, from the executive, parliament, the civil society, churches, and the citizens themselves. So this play has become so popular, and we have realized that in as much as we only wanted to perform it in cities for lack of funding, but there is that high demand that if we could take it into so many local languages, because it has made the message of corruption and public finance management a little bit more simpler. So, and this is the missing link. Most of the civil society that we have working in the space also have not taken interest to translate the information that they have, to get it down to the people and how it relates to the people so that the common people themselves can actually take part in public affairs. Thank you so much. I hope that responds to the question.
Yes, that was a very good response. I was going to ask how we can get to see your play. If you have a link or something, maybe if you manage to put it online, maybe you can also just share it with us. I think it would be good for people to see what else other people are doing, just to share that message, especially to communities that where English is not a first language, or where people don't understand English that well. I think those different ideas would help other people as well. So I'm going to ask, there's two other questions that I think we'll be able to tackle in this. Also one question that we can tackle in this question and answer. And then the second question, I think I will ask Dr. Mrisa to tackle it when he does his presentation. So the first question, which we can tackle now, is how are CSOs navigating accountability in the face of restrictive laws? That's a question that was asked by Clarissa. And I will ask Luchembe, if you could, maybe if you could try to respond to that question. And then Dr. Mrisa, I'm sure you'll tackle this in your presentation shortly. There's a question that has come from Brenda saying, how effective is civic engagement in policy tracking issues, considering the economic factors in the African countries, particularly in Zimbabwe? I'm sure Dr. Mrisa will be able to tackle that when he comes on board. But Luchembe, would you be able to talk about CSOs navigating accountability, especially where we've got restrictive laws?
Yeah, thank you so much. So indeed, this is a very important question, and I think most of our laws in Southern Africa, and even just in Africa generally, are very restrictive in terms of how we engage and hold our governments accountable. Talk about issues to do. I think recently we're actually revising the cybersecurity bill. Issues to do with just allowing people to be open and freely express themselves and hold government accountable is a norm of every government in our countries. But so how, as civil society, how are we navigating around these laws? I think one is to put a very important note as we do this work as civil society organizations. We are doing this work to supplement government's efforts. We're doing this work to ensure that development is attained in our communities and in the country at large. So, and every government, be it corrupted or not corrupted, its aim is to ensure that citizens benefit from the national resources and ensure that there is development at the end of the day. So with that understanding, then we can try to ensure that as we engage, as we bring in the aspect of accountability, we are pushing the agenda of development. We are not holding people accountable to just publicly embarrass them that you've stolen money, you have misappropriated funds. We are bringing this conversation on the table to say, how do we ensure that there is effective service delivery to a mere citizen in this country, and ensure that at the end of the day the development is taking place? Because if we begin to look at accountability as a way of finding faults, as a way of publicly shaming duty bearers or the politicians and the like, definitely the restrictive laws will be used on us, even as individuals or as leads of civil society organizations. So we need to have an understanding that accountability is about providing a platform, providing opportunities for citizens to be able to dialogue, for citizens to be able to engage with their duty bearers, for them to be able to explain how these resources are being utilized, how the different development programs are being implemented.
Luchembe, not sure if you can hear me, but it seems like your network
Was
might.
not to be able to speak on development issues. So we need to look at strategies and tactics on how we're going to implement or use issues of accountability for our development in different countries that we are working in.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Luchembe, for that contribution. I think your network did kind of get stable towards the end, but we got most of what you were saying. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand over now, like I said earlier, to Dr. Tendai Mrisa, who is the Executive Director of Civio Institute. He is going to talk about civil society and government accountability. And just as I hope it will be fine for me to ask you as well, Dr. Mrisa, to answer that question that we had on how effective is civic engagement in policy tracking issues, considering the economic factors in the African countries with a specific emphasis on Zimbabwe. Dr. Mrisa, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Belinda. And still morning, right? No, still morning. Good morning, colleagues. And apologies for being late and then the disruptions to the program. But I think it has actually worked very well that we are having the discussion now when we have had all the other experiences from across the 3 countries and also the question and answer session that we just had. And thanks to Edda for holding fort and also for Belinda. And I think the starting point is a question that we ask ourselves and here at the Civio Institute is, how should we make democracy work as it should? So I think that's a very fundamental question because we are engaged in a process of saying democracy for us is not a stage or a moment, but democracy is a culture, is a way of life. So it's not something that happens overnight, just like that, to say, oh, now we have democracy. It's something that we work towards. It's not rain that falls down. It's something that we work towards. So in my intervention, we try to say, let's understand the phases of democratization across Africa, and especially for us here in the SADC region. So we start off with the phase of the liberation phase itself as an integral part of the democratization struggle. So we start off with that liberation from colonization. The countries under discussion today going through different ways of how they attain their liberation. Zimbabwe through an armed struggle, Malawi and Zambia through a negotiated settlement, etc. But still it's not something that was just signed, but there are actually some people who died for that liberation in both the countries. So that's one phase. Then immediately after that, 10 to 15 years, what we had in those first years, especially in Malawi and also in Zambia, is what you can call maybe a de jure one-party state. Founding fathers, Kaunda in Zambia and Banda in Malawi. Here in Zimbabwe, we had maybe what we may call a de facto one-party state, that we never legislated for a one-party state, but that's what we had. And also then 10 years, 15 years into our independence, different stages, for Zambia longer and for Malawi longer, we now face what we may call the winds of change. And in that in the process of winds of change, there are agitations for multi-party democracies that are constitutionally established, etc. So we see, and that those struggles are led mostly by trade unionists, etc. And a very important part of the struggle for democratization. So we begin to see the undoing of the one-party state. In West Africa, it had been mostly military regimes. We're seeing a transition to civilian governments, etc. A critical component of our transition to democracy. So I would say that was the first stage of democratization. Then we enter into multi-party democracies. The focus then at that time, which is very important, was on how we conduct our elections. So we spent a lot of money and time around making sure that our elections are free and fair. So every election had to be free and fair. And for us to do that, we had to, number one, invest in election observers, we had to invest in NGOs that are actually engaged in elections. And in that moment, also sadly, we lost something about citizenship. We reduced citizens into voters because we began to say the most important role that you can play as a citizen is to be a voter. So I'll explain how that affects civic engagement broadly when we reduce citizens there. Because another thing that we always say here, it's a hypothetical statement. We say elections on their own are necessary, but not a sufficient condition for democracy. So it's very important for us to understand that elections on their own do not then give us the democracy that we require. So, but that's something that we invested in, especially coming from the 1990s when we're sort of undone the one-party states. We began to sort of focus on regular elections that are free and fair. So we invested a lot of time in making sure that there are election observers, that we are developing NGOs that will focus on those elections. So this experiment has been in the making. But unfortunately, even with that having been achieved in countries like Zambia successfully, that they've managed to change regimes several times now. They've had different ruling parties, same with Malawi, except for Zimbabwe. But what we see in the three countries is the same conditions still prevail. Poverty is still an issue. There are increasing levels of inequality. There's an emergence in all the three countries of a very narrow politically connected elite that is getting all the business opportunities, etc. And also new sort of forms of investors coming from not necessarily the traditional investing countries, that is the global West, but we're beginning to see investors from China, etc. But really for our people, nothing has really changed. Collapse of service delivery, it has worsened in many countries, neglect of critical development issues. In fact, there is a joke that we always say when we talk about Malawi. Under Kamuzu Banda, the last famine had been around 1948, 1949, thereabouts. But immediately after Kamuzu Banda, when Bakili Muluzi comes into power, there's a famine in Malawi. Immediately, I think within the 2 years of Bakili's reign. So we begin to say to yourself, what does it mean? You know, but if you look at the policies that were followed, then the privatization of ADMARC and other measures, you now have a famine. So the question was, are we saying that authoritarian one-party states were better for achieving food security? But it's something that sort of, we focused maybe on the liberal version of democracy, focusing on these changes to say every man's vote matters, political parties should be able to do this, but maybe we forgot the economic dimension of democracy. So the questions of rural development are neglected across, except maybe for Zimbabwe post-2000. So issues to do with the modernization of the peasantry. Our peasantries in most of the countries that are under discussion, they still use backward technologies. There's nothing to speak for their independence because they're still very backward. Industrialization is actually slowed down. There's very limited industrialization. And like I said, the quality of service delivery in most of the countries under discussion is also either stagnated or actually regressed. So, and the ways in which our natural resources, or sort of our natural resources are utilized still follows the same pattern. They're extroverted. Then the challenges to do with resource mobilization. How are we using financial resources in our countries? John has already talked about how it remains opaque. It's unclear how resources are allocated, how resources are being utilized. So the debt question remains, and it actually looms large in the SADC region, in the countries under discussion. Zambia being exposed even to private equity debts, but also having the fortune maybe of being able to secure on a continuous basis new terms of debt, etc., etc. So all these challenges as to say, so what then? What exactly are we going to be doing differently? Because we had been given democracy, electoral democracy, constitutional democracy as the silver bullet that is going to fix our problems. So every election period, we know this. Political parties, they make promises, they are elected into office, but we do not know or did not know what happens next. And this is what always happens. And we say here at Civio that public officers or political parties promise, citizens expect, but nothing happens in the middle. You know, we wait for the others. And what was happening in certain instances before this period, what we're beginning to see was actually the repackaging of electoral manifestos. A manifesto written 5 years before, it's just repackaged, new terms are put in there and thrown in there, because no one really reads these 200-page documents, 300-page documents. They're just announced and we celebrate it. But what we have seen now is the critical moment that the colleagues have spoken to, the entering in of what I will call the accountability moment or the accountability movement. And it starts off by, number one, on the need of the consensus to hold governments around regional and international compacts. So is to say, how do we determine the effectiveness of government? Because the challenge that we have had, even as CSOs, with our energy and our passion, at times we have not been able to generate evidence to hold our power holders accountable. So now we're beginning to see a new generation of CSOs that are tracking. Initially, we start tracking around international compacts, the SDGs, regional compacts, the AU protocols, Agenda 2063, things like CARDIP, allocation of certain percentages towards agriculture, towards education, towards health. Beginning to see movements congeal around these compacts and begin to say, we need to be tracking how governments are allocating resources towards these processes. So that's the beginning really of the accountability movement, because we now begin to discuss budget in a different way. The gender groups are discussing to say, are we making sure that we're investing? Is the budget gender friendly? Is the budget child friendly? Is the budget allocating sufficient resources towards education, towards health issues, etc.? So we begin to see this, but still the movement remains sort of disconnected. So there are people who are agitating for their 10% in agriculture, for their 15% in health, for another percent here, but there are there connections that are coming in. So we actually find that at times we look like we're fighting against each other. There are these silos in the accountability movement. So now what we begin, and initial approaches entail things like scorecards. We'll come up with scorecards, how our government is doing vis-a-vis implementing the previous compact before SDGs, which was the Millennium Development Goals. So with these scorecards that we developed and we're measuring the implementation of different Millennium Development Goals. Then we moved into compliance reports. How compliant is our country in terms of domesticating laws that are made at international compacts? So we ran with that. Then we had the EPAs, etc. But now what we're beginning to see is a new sort of maybe a new generation within civil society with new capacities. And these are capacities of leveraging two things, leveraging technology and also leveraging sort of capacity to analyze data. Heavy data analysis, finger crunching, being able to analyze budgets and make sense out of budgets. So then we begin to see this emerging movement, which Eda was talking about when she gave you the different countries that have these trackers, starting in Senegal, because Senegal is one of the first countries that actually has a tracker that tracks Macky Sall, to begin to say Macky Sall, when he was campaigning, he made all these promises. To what extent he's actually implementing it? Then we also see the same sort of energy moving into Nigeria with the Buhari meter. We see the same in Burkina Faso, the same in Mali, etc. In Mali, it has been disrupted maybe by the coup, but in other countries, it still goes on. But Southern Africa was a bit late into the party. There was nothing really tangible. Colleagues in Zambia tried something, but I would say that what was more visible were the attempts here in Zimbabwe when President Emmerson Mnangagwa was sort of in the process of the transition, when we're that period between the coup, which was not a coup, into the elections. There were lots of promises being made, and many in civil society were concerned to say, how are we going to track this? So they emerged two trackers, actually. There was the Mnangagwa meter and the one that we run called ZimCitizensWatch.org. So that's sort of it. But the importance really was to say, we need to be asking important questions to say, number one, when we're looking at what political parties are doing, because there's a new behavior amongst political parties, all of them are producing manifestos. But the question that we're asking is, who reads these manifestos? Yeah. And how do people actually make voting decisions? Do people make voting decisions after reading all the 5 or 10 manifestos produced, or people already vote based on their personalities, regional affiliation, language affiliation, or even church affiliation for us here in Zimbabwe and even colleagues in Malawi? And how do elected political parties implement or commit to their plans? Because there was no one talking about it to say, oh, once you've done this manifesto and you're elected into office, what then do you do with the manifesto? We just left it there. And in many instances, like I said, we saw this then just being made to be sort of cleaned up, next elections, etc. That sort of became like a joke. But then with the new competencies that we begin to see in civil society, what we're doing now is we're holding a mirror and saying, this is how you are performing vis-a-vis the promises that you made to your citizens. So it's, like I said, it's new competencies. It's we're leveraging technology. And actually, when you begin to connect the dots, you see that it's just not an analysis of manifestos. Others are actually tracking the budget itself. How is the budget being done vis-a-vis the promises? When the government of Zimbabwe say they're going to build 1.5 million houses. So the thing is, yes, you can be following and saying, oh, this year they built 2 houses, 3 houses. But the easiest way is to look at their budget to say, in this budget, how many houses can actually be built based on what they've allocated? So we began to do that and to see that. So what do we expect from this new sort of very sort of exciting space that speaks to different generations and also maybe helps us to move the needle a bit around accountability? Number one, it is evidence informed. So we're hoping that we begin to see an improved ways in which we use evidence in our advocacy. So we are now beginning to say, we're not going to wait for government to give us their own report, but we are producing our shadow reports on how government is performing. And this is very important also in the sense that prior to this, most of the reports that were written about our countries were either written by our governments or they were written by international, either NGOs or development agencies. But now we're beginning to see growing capacities within civil society to write national reports. In Mali and in Burkina Faso, the launch of these reports is very huge. It's a national event in Burkina, so that the president would actually come and be part of that launch of the report so that they can also respond to the same report. So I'll talk about this when I talk about the effectiveness of the challenges. So we also then begin to marry what the manifesto is saying, an analysis of budget performance, which is very important. But also we begin to marry what the manifesto is saying vis-a-vis other compacts, the regional compacts that we have and international compacts. And also what we are beginning to learn is that tracking of a manifesto written is in itself not sufficient, because what we have learned, number one, the manifesto, even if it's implemented fully, you may actually find that it's not developmental. So I think there's need for a quick critique at the beginning, maybe at the pilot stage within the first 100 days or the first year, to say that even if this government followed up on the implementation of its manifesto, it's most likely not to meet SDGs. It's most likely not to meet Agenda 2063 goals. So that we begin to say that there is actually a gap. Because remember, the electorate is not going to subject the manifesto to scrutiny to say, does this really contribute to development? There are always contradictions in the manifestos. But half the time, because the citizenry has not been as critical as it should, we've actually let political parties get away with murder. So that's very important in terms of how we analyze the manifestos. So, but governments are not relenting or conceding or even ceding space. So number two, they do not provide information. John has been very clear about this, that they make sure that information is in a black box that you cannot enter into. It's a huge challenge for many of us who are doing this tracking work, because half the time you're depending on media reports, you're depending on this. When you try to go to government, like we're struggling right now with the Minister of Agriculture, just trying to track and understand the irrigation projects that they have resuscitated in itself. So you have to use backroom channels. You go to people that you went to school with to get some information, but that's not how it should work. So there's also an issue for us to begin to agitate for what we're calling an open data or sort of open governance regimes, which we're beginning to see in other areas where government documents are made publicly available. All these allocations are in a certain portal that we can all access them as citizens. So it's one of the challenges of advocacy for those who are carrying out these trackers. And then number two, governments are also engaged in a process of delegitimizing some of us who carry out these trackers, because they see the danger where the people are holding the mirror and where the people who are rating their performance, where the people who are saying you've scored 4 out of 10. So it's easy. So rather than dealing with us, because maybe we're few at the moment, it's easy to delegitimize us. Case in point, in Zimbabwe, when we produced the latest barometer report, which is an annual report we produce from every year, tracking performance of government. One of the things that they said about us was to say we're a fake organization, et cetera, et cetera. It was only after engaging with them and showing them our data, that's when they begin to sort of engage in a more professional way. But they're always going to try to delegitimize. It's the quickest way to say, this is a fake organization funded by regime change agents, et cetera, et cetera. But we know what we're trying to do. The method is to say we need to make sure that office holders commit to the promises they make. Then also the real challenge that we face is that for a country like Zimbabwe, and even all the other countries in SADC, there are new laws against NGOs, punitive laws against NGOs that are being imposed. And they challenge our freedoms to carry out civic engagement as we should, because we realize that at certain points we need to nuance our criticism. At certain points we need to pull back a bit so that we can comply with the regulations in place. So that's one. The laws themselves, they're overbearing, they're difficult to manage, etc. Compliance is becoming a huge issue for many of us. But also funding for this kind of work is highly exploratory work. We cannot begin to say with certainty the kind of results we will achieve. And donors want quick answers. So at times donors do not answer to proposals like ours quickly, or do not sort of agree to fund at the levels they should fund. So at times we struggle because we've got this portal and we've got all this data, but we cannot analyze it fully because we do not have the resources and the wherewithal to really analyze in depth what the data we're collecting is saying about us. So we are also hoping that as the accountability movement grows around these trackers, etc., that donors will also see the value of this work and begin to fund it in a more meaningful way. So I want to talk about what is the effectiveness then of civic engagement in this space. I've already talked about the constraints that we face as a community doing this work. On the one hand, we're marginal, we're very few, we're not as vocal as what others are. And some of the things that we end up saying at times are confused even in polarized environments. Because in our reports, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on where you stand politically, there are certain times when we have to actually praise government to say they did well. They made a promise to do this, they've effectively met it. This government, for instance, made a promise that they will build a dam in each and every province. We're seeing those dams. They made a promise around irrigation schemes, rehabilitation of them. We're seeing them come up. We're seeing smallholders participating within the wheat value chain. They made that promise. But also, so it becomes difficult for a civil society that leans to a certain political or partisan position. That's number one. You're always going to face fire from those who are supposed to be your friends when you begin to sound like you're affirming what government has done. So you are there, those in the opposition, those in civil society will be criticizing your work on that basis. Then on the other hand, as you criticize governments, also others, so you're always in the middle and it's a tenuous place. You know, you have very few friends in the space given our our polarization as a country. And I'm hoping that this does not play out as it is in Zimbabwe, say in Malawi and in Zambia. But polarization is a growing global concern in saying that even in our analysis, we need to temper it and align with a certain political party position, which is something that we're trying to avoid, trying to stay on the middle, but it's very difficult. So that's one thing that we have to engage. So our effectiveness, number one, is being objective with data. Because at times you need a place where you can say, we're looking for a reliable platform that we know we can trust. From whatever political background you may be coming from, at some point you need objective data. So I think that's one area that we've been effective in gathering sort of neutral objective data. That's number one. And number two, making available evidence. So let me use the Zambia example. When we started tracking the performance of President Hichilema, one of the things that we began to see soon after our visit in Lusaka, now every time the government in Zambia announces their progress, they actually use our language. They say, we promised and we have done this. Yeah. So we can tell that they've caught on to what we're saying and they're looking at it. And here in Zimbabwe, government actually said to us, when they eventually engaged with us, they said, we think the president needs to be seeing this tracker on a screen in his office every day so that he can know where his cabinet is in terms of implementation. So for us, generating our tracker outside of his office and him opening it like anyone else would do and using it for his work, it's fine with us. As long as we are not sitting in his office and working as if we're now part of his bureaucracy, it's fine with us. So that's what we are doing to say that. So and the colleagues in South Africa who picked up our work, there is I think it's GIZ who works within the president of South Africa. They're also fascinated in saying we need this methodology of tracking. So it's very important for us to track. But another thing which I thought this question was really raising was to say, in a poor country like Zimbabwe, Malawi, or Zambia, is there fiscal autonomy for the country to actually achieve some of the promises it makes, or it actually depends on donors? which is a very important question that we have to consider to say, do our African governments have the policy autonomy space to come up with measures to achieve what is in their manifesto? That's number one, policy autonomy. The second question is around fiscal autonomy. Do they have the resources, or they are depending on donors to fund some of the development projects that they committed themselves to in the manifestos? That's the challenge of being an underdeveloped economy, that at times you depend on external partners. But for us, because it's a compact, it's a promise that was made at the election stage with the commitment to say, if you vote for me, this is what we're going to do. The same thing with the young man when he's trying to get married, says, if you agree to marry me, I'll do this. That's what we're tracking, where they'll get the resources, etc. Unless if they write a statement to say, we thought we could do this power station with our international partners, but funding has not been available. We can call that either a modified or a broken promise, depending on how government responds. Because for us, it's also the issue to do with governments being responsive to the people that voted them into office. So whenever they break a promise, it is better to really explain why that promise has been broken or modified. Belinda, thank you so much. I'll end here, then we can have discussions, if any.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dr. Marisa, for that. And yeah, I think you raised a lot of issues. I think all the way from talking about how the way current governments were formed, or just looking at the liberation journeys that African countries have had, still impacts the way those countries are governed. That the way they're governed, that's a key point. And I think especially for younger people, we always kind of forget that history does influence in many ways what happens today. So I would like to open up for our last round of questions and answers before I bring back Dr. Marisa, just to say votes of thanks. If there's anybody who's in the event room and wants to say something, you can raise your hand and I can pull you up. If you want to make a comment as well, you're free to do that. Before I go to anyone else in the room, I'll just like to ask Eda Joa. I think you heard the presentation from her earlier. What are your thoughts, Eda, on the conversation that has happened already? Kind of getting your input, the presentation that you did, looking at how we are tracking that, those policies, the manifestos, and what you've just heard from the different speakers.
Great, thanks, Belinda, for allowing me to come back in. I think the key thing for me in terms of just this entire process and discussion is that it is a process. It's something that's, it's going to take time. There'll be refinements, there'll be things that we need to change. But ultimately, I think going back to Luchembe's earlier point is that the accountability needs to be demanded by citizens. I don't think it's something that, governments will give freely to, or, will freely accede to. It's got to be something that really citizens make demand of their governments. But in addition, it also means that their role and responsibility within the public space and the public sphere, extends beyond just that of being voters. They have then a critical role, to then keep on playing the day after elections, for that 5-year period or 5-year term. How then, are they working with government, towards the fulfillment, I think, of improved societies. Because as I said initially, the tracking is happening based on the political party manifestos, and the promises that are made there. But I think as something that Tendai alluded to is that oftentimes as well, even the way those promises are coined or are fashioned at times is also not in consultation with citizens, with the electorate, and whilst maybe they might be good, and whilst maybe governments might be making progress towards achieving some of those policy promises, or goals, what does it ultimately mean, for the livelihoods, for the well-being, for the social welfare of citizens on the ground? So I think at some point in time, there's got to then be a melding or a co-creation then of what then should be the promises, or, that government should keep, and should be willing to keep and should be held accountable for. I think like a case in point, so I'm just thinking about the question that was asked by Pastor Mandas in terms of, what have been the trends that we kind of pick up in terms of, where maybe policy promises are being kept, or there's significant progress being made, and where are they maybe promises are either broken or there's not significant progress that's being made. So like if we take a case in point of Zimbabwe, which, we've been tracking now for the last 4 years, but it's also similar. If we're seeing a similar kind of trend or pattern, even in Malawi and Zambia, is that, within the economic sphere, the economy is where a lot of effort and energy is being put, but that at times is coming now at the detriment, let's say, of social services and governance issues, and social services really also become important because people want access to basic and better healthcare. There's need for education, there's need for social safety nets, and security. There's no point, maybe in terms of, for example, government saying that our promise is really to, live within our means, live within our budgets. It's good, but then ultimately the sacrifice sometimes that comes out of that is that social services are diminished. And so that becomes kind of like then, I guess, the case in point around also why there needs to be that discussion or maybe co-creation of the actual promises that a government then must be then held accountable for.
Thank you so much, Eda, for your contribution. I've been looking at some of the comments that have come through. Munyara Zimataruse says, thank you so much, Dr. Mrisa, for that thought-provoking submission. And Brenda as well says, thank you, Dr. Mrisa, for the insightful response. I'm thinking Jeff was also thanking Mr. Chilembe for his contribution. And I think Claude was saying, John makes some valid points. Unfortunately, John has had to leave the meeting to attend another, but I'm sure he'll probably get to watch this later. So Claude was saying, John makes some valid points. Accountability needs to be demanded by citizens, and they can use this tracker at local level to design mini community scorecards to evaluate the performance of their duty bearers. Very important. So thank you so much for all those comments and contributions. Now, I would like to, in the spirit of democracy, I would like to open up to, one or two individuals, if there's anybody who would like to make a comment, a contribution, or ask one or two last questions for anyone else in the room who would like to do that. I see no hands, and that's fine. I'm going to then invite our speakers. I think we had...
Hi, Brenda.
Oh, yes.
Sorry, my apologies. I was trying to raise my hand, but I couldn't, it wasn't happening. Just a quick question, just really from, and this could be directed, I think, to Dr. Mrisa.
Okay.
I'm wondering how effective accountability movements can actually be built at country level. I was listening to your submission and I was thinking about how there is a variety of local players that are doing this work, but collaboration and I think more importantly, coordination and how it's done, I could be missing it, but it doesn't come out quite clearly. So from a practical point of view, how could we effectively build accountability movements at a country level? Thanks.
Thank you, Munyaradzi. Dr. Mbisa, would you like to tackle that?
You know, okay, no, that's look, let me start with the tough one first, yeah. So the movement is not yet a congealed movement. There are, like I said earlier, you may find that there's a health accountability movement, an education accountability movement, and others around, maybe even residents associations raising accountability issues. Then these ones, the new entrants into the space who are looking at how to sort of keep political parties disciplined across the promises that they make. But how do that come? How will that come together? It may not even happen that we come together to form one, but it may be that our work creates synergies. Our work contributes to the other. So for instance, for some of us, we celebrate it when media picks up our work, when journalists use our work, our reports, or our platform to write, when colleagues in the health section use our reports to sort of make their submissions. Colleagues in mining do the same. So the idea is to say, in the movement, each one is going to play a part. We are always saying we support those on the front lines of change with the kind of interventions that we make. So we try to provide information, and we now also train on civic engagement. We have an online course around civic engagement, and we're going to develop a small module around how to use trackers, et cetera, within that civic engagement. But if it ever happens, and I don't want to sound like I'm a prophet, but if it ever happens that these movements find an opportunity to come together, because I think for me, the most important thing is to understand the zeitgeist, the spirit of the moment. I think we're in a place whereby we're talking about accountability as the most important part of the democracy project on the continent. That's where we are. We have moved from liberation. We have moved we have constitutions in place. We now have changed political parties for quite a number of years. We're now used to it, except maybe you Zimbabweans. Then we're at a stage whereby we're beginning to say, but all these have not yielded the utopia or the vision of democracy, because democracy at the end of the day should be associated with justice, freedom, equality, etc. We're yet to see that at the bottom in the communities. So at the moment, the consensus globally is to say we need to make sure that our governments are accountable with the resources that they have. Yeah. So one of the ways in which we make them accountable is to make sure that we develop these tools so that we can track. So I always say that it's one thing to do a Zim Citizens Watch or an African Citizens Watch, but you also need to complement that with a budget analysis, because it's this budget that is going to tell you if this is being implemented. In the absence of the two speaking to each other, we don't have anything. And also, it's one thing to have a Zim Citizens Watch, but it's too broad. We have health concerns, we have education concerns, we have climate change concerns. So all these contribute to a whole. So, but the hook around it being accountability. How do we make sure that there is accountability, starting with the local, then moving into our regional compacts, then moving into the international community? So I think all those things are necessary, but will it become one day we'll find ourselves working together? I don't think so. I just think that as long as there's consensus that we need to increase and to improve on innovations that enhance accountability on the usage of public resources. Thanks, Belinda.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that response, Doc, and also to Munyaradzi for asking that question. Pastor Mandaza, Elliot Mandaza would like to make a comment or a contribution. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Belinda. I may have missed it, so my apologies if I'm being redundant, but I wanted to find out, of all the players we're talking about in terms of the track and accountability, I know there's civic society and of course the government interaction. What has been the response from opposition players, and how has the use or uptake of the tracker improved our political dialogue and debate in terms of migrating us to more effective conversation that's, if I could call it, politics of ideas and pushing for substance in our political discourses. I hope that's a clear question. Thank you.
Okay. Eda, would you like to tackle that? I think
Sure.
yeah. Okay. You got the question right?
Yes, I got the question. I'll try and do it justice. So, I think coming from a space of highly polarized, emotive politics, we still have some headway to make. It depends on sometimes what the tracker is showing. So in the instances, because the aim really is to be objective, in the instances where at times it's shown that government has made progress in a particular issue or effort, it has left some parties, a bit disgruntled. In the instances where it shows, whenever we maybe do the barometer report or analysis, which is like what has been their performance, over the last couple of years, there tends to then be, for those who, are anti-government or, are in the opposition or, feel a certain way around the party that's in play. The focus then really is then on the broken promises, so what has been broken. I know we've tried to then come in and really kind of like buttress and to say that, it needs to be looked at in a holistic manner. That's why we have the different categorizations, so that then we see, okay, fine, what then is in progress? What has not been commenced? What has been modified? And at the end of the day, what does that overall situation mean? We do the barometer report again, also just to assess the quality of the actions. Yes, maybe something might be in progress or have been implemented, but the quality or the nature of the action is, there's some doubts around it. So I think we still have a ways to go. It's the first kind of iteration of this within this current, governance cycle. We hope then that as we continue with the tracking process, and I think as the movement or, coalition around accountability grows, that it then makes our engagement or within the political space, become more issues-based as opposed to be, policy or what you call it, highly emotive, and, just really based about party and highly partisan. So I think we still need to make progress around that. It's again, just around popularizing, getting the tool out, doing the various analyses and reports, and making sure that it's on the desks of, everybody, no matter what political alignment, or party alignment that they have. But I think in summary, we still have some inroads to make. But one of the things I think has been highlighted is that we've seen kind of like a trend from government in trying to be more, I think, open, and be more on the front foot about what it is that it's doing, and letting citizens know that this is what government is doing, and then tying it back to the promises that it had made to their party manifestos. So I don't know if that's helped answer your question.
Okay, all right, that's fine. Thank you for that. Dr. Mrisa, any comments there?
Just a quick one to Pastor Mandaza. Just imagine this, Pastor Mandaza. If one of the members of your church was to come and say, Pastor, I'm going to be voting in 2023 for the first time. Who should I vote for? What answer do you give them? Do you give them your own personal opinion, or you actually refer them to something that they can use? Because for us, when we did this, on the one hand, it is really about analyzing and helping improve the performance of government. But on the other hand, is about helping citizens make informed decisions about the political party they are going to vote for. So it's unfair that we sound like we're tracking only the incumbent party that is ruling, the ruling party. But if you remember, we were also tracking, and Zimbabwe is unique in this way, in that the urban councils are run by the opposition. So in an ideal position, we should have been able to say, this is how the opposition, that was sort of the ruling party in the local authorities, has performed. And this is how the other party has performed in terms of national issues. So it provides a basis, because what we're just saying is, how do you make a decision on who to vote for as a citizen? You are the youth, you are whatever, you've got certain interests. Because we started off this by what we call the manifesto ZIMAT, the manifesto analysis tool, where we're actually analyzing to say, of these political parties that are vying for office, how many are committing to youth-related promises? How many are committing to women-related promises? How many are committing to, we're raising all these issues. And we're comparing, how do they differ around economic policy? What are the rural issues that they are raising? So that was at promise level. Then we're saying to, how have they fared? How is this party that won done in the 5 years? So I think political parties at the moment, certainly in Zimbabwe, we're yet to see them use their stages, the political platforms that they have, to raise policy issues in a granular way. We have promises of these big projects, et cetera, but there's no granular way, except maybe here and there. But it would be interesting for them to also begin to look at this platform and to use it, not necessarily for dialogue with each other, but for saying, this may work, this might not work. Even ZANU-PF itself needs to look at our reports and begin to say, we missed out on X or we missed out on Y. How do we move forward to make sure that we do it in the next electoral cycle? So these are all suggestions on how the tool can be used and multifaceted. But for me, when I was designing this, it was targeted at the person who is today, who was 14 or 15 years in 2018 and is going to be a first-time voter in 2023. How do I help that child to make a decision on who to vote for?
Thank you, Dr. Mrisa. And I don't see any other hands for people who'd like to make a comment, which is fine. Maybe last 5 seconds, if there is anybody. I saw a quick hand that went down. Was that John or Kumbu?
It was Luchembo.
Okay. All right, you can go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think Doc has already talked to it, but in terms of making accountability movements successful.
Sorry to interrupt you, Luchembe. Maybe as you're making that comment, please can you also give your closing remarks? Because I was going to go to the other speakers as well after this, just to ask them for theirs. So you can make your comments and then go into that quickly.
Okay, great. So yeah, I wanted to just make a comment on accountability movements more successful. I think when you talk about accountability, it's one aspect that will not be done by one institution or one individual. I think it becomes imperative for collective efforts, proper coordination, if we're going to do successfully manage to do accountability. And also it brings in the aspect of ensuring that community members, the people themselves, have the power to hold the leaders accountable. This will not be done by civil society individually. I think it's very easy for government. Earlier we talked about restrictive laws that government would use to shut down those that would be speaking louder, or those that would be asking the questions. So it's important to build the capacity of citizens to be able to hold leaders accountable. Then we're going to have successful accountability movements. If we decide as civil society to continue working and to be louder in our work and to be heard as the ones that are speaking more, I think it will be very difficult for us to be able to achieve the accountability work. We need to build the capacity of citizens to be able to hold the leaders accountable, to be able to hold the politicians accountable, to be able to speak for themselves as opposed to civil society organizations to speak. So I just wanted to emphasize on that point. I know Doc had already spoken to it and provided a clear guidance. So now we're going to ensure that these accountability movements are successful. In my last comments, I think we need also these tools that citizens can easily access and be able to to track back on what government had promises. The failures with regards to accountability in most of our countries is because once politicians make pronouncements, we celebrate with those pronouncements at the time when they are campaigning and they want to get the votes and all that. Once they get into the offices, we forget about the promises and we begin to ask for different things, and this makes it difficult to hold our leaders accountable. So if we're going to hold our leaders accountable, we need trackers, as Sylvia has done, where you provide a tracker of the commitments, the promises that these governments were making, and we begin to follow it up. I know it's not been easy. For example, we tried to do with social contracts where, as politicians were making pronouncements, we engage and try and say, can you sign a social contract so we can hold you accountable to these contracts? Politicians will not easily accept to do that. They'll find a way of, saying, look, if I manage to get into power and I have to do my work, this will be something that I work on, but I will not be able to commit and sign. So if we can easily follow through and be able to write down or put these commitments or these promises somewhere where it's visible and citizens are able to follow, I think it's very important, and ensure that we are reminding our leaders, our members of parliament, our civic leaders, our presidents to say, look, these are the commitments that you are signed up to and you're supposed to fulfill them. I think it becomes very important. But as I said, citizens are key in ensuring that accountability is attained. Just like John had said, accountability would only come about when citizens demand for it. If we expect government to give us on a silver platter, we will definitely not get it. So we need our citizens to have the capacity to be able to ask, to be able to engage, to be able to understand the policies. Then we'll be able to achieve the aspect of accountability in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will ask for closing remarks from Suzgo and then Eda. If you can just, in 30 seconds, just give us your closing remarks. Is Suzgo still connected? Maybe not. So Eda, if we can go to you.
Yes, I think I was trying to check the gadget. No, thank you so much. The last speaker and the other speakers have summed it all. Citizens must be at the center of pushing for change or pushing for accountability. And those that are working in the space, the CSOs are equally critical to provide that kind of ammunition to the citizen, because what they lack is information. Government will come in handy to the civil society. We have actually seen quite a number of them in Malawi have been given positions into public service as a way of saying thank you, or as a way of silencing them. So the biggest opportunity that we have is that the leadership we have seen in Malawi is quite responsive, especially where the citizens are engaged. The elections that Malawi held in 2020, which were fresh presidential elections nullified by the court, it's firmly believed that without citizen engagement, that election would not have been possible. But because of citizen participation and pressure, we saw the desired change coming. While the civil society seems to be slackening in a way, there is still a space in Malawi, and that's where we come in. Some of us coming from the journalism background and also trying to move in using theatre to empower the citizen. I think that way would also able to make the required difference. And as my last point, why we are thinking theatre may help, because I mean there are usually threats. If you try to talk about accountability, either they use the law to lock you up or just to silence you. But I think the theater way, because you're trying to dramatize certain situations, you're using creative means to pass on information. We think that way would be able to make a huge contribution in making citizens aware of their own rights and also stimulate that interest to participate in public affairs. Thank you so much. And I also say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this to this meeting. Really, I've gained from the other speakers. I wished it could go on and on. It was quite insightful. Thank you.
Yes, it was. Thank you so much for that, Susgo. Eda, your closing remarks?
Thanks, Belinda. I think I'll just keep it quite short as well. I think what we're doing and what this process unlocks a lot for all of us is the need to redefine citizenship and what it means to be a citizen in a country. You know, this current way or status quo has not worked. It's failed. It's not delivered on the development and democracy promises that, I think citizens have in mind or that they were promised. Citizens have to be actively engaged in processes, in public processes. And I think the online tracking, the tracking processes, tracking of government performance is really just a start and an entry point towards doing that. So it's a long-term process, it's a long-term commitment for citizens, for civil society, but I think it's one that's absolutely necessary if there's really going to be a shift in how we outwork and think about democracy and development on the continent.
Thank you so much for that, Eda. And also just to say to all our speakers today, thank you so much for your contributions. They were invaluable. And just as Susbe said, we could talk about this all day because it is a very important subject and one that's very close to home for all of us because we are living in it. I know people say this is Africa, but this is the Africa for us, and this is where we are living, and our children are going to school in this Africa. We are working in this Africa. So we all have a vested interest in making it work. I'd like to invite Dr. Marisa just to give his vote of thanks and closing remarks. And then after that, we can come to an end for today. Dr. Marisa.
I was wondering what will happen after that, because you said after that. Then I thought the program continues. You never know, Belinda and the youngsters. Yeah. So yeah, no, I'm glad that colleagues, I think, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. I hope that it will be one of many that the team will organize many other conversations around this issue. Because like I said, it's number one, we need to have that big picture around where we are as a continent and what we're trying to achieve. So that cannot be done in a 2-hour session. That needs more time. So I'm so grateful that we had this, and grateful also for the lessons we're learning from our colleagues in Malawi, our colleagues in Zambia, how we can improve, etc. There is no perfect product. There is no perfect approach. We're always learning incrementally. And hopefully the goal really is for democracy to work as it should. So I think as long as we are connected that way, we are part of one, doing different things, but we're part of one. So without further ado, just to say, keep on keeping on. The work that you're doing is very important. As and when we can help, drop us a line, let us know how we can help. And also if there's anything new that you think we need to be also aware of that we can learn from, do the same, let us know. We are here just to learn. We're also here to help improve, contribute towards the enhancing the accountability movement across Zimbabwe and Southern Africa into Africa. Thanks, Belinda. Thanks, Eda, for putting it all together. And thank you to the team behind the scenes, Metron, Leon, Claire, and I believe Shirley, for putting all this together. Thank you again. Until next time, see you later.
Okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Mrisa, for those closing remarks. And just some last thing, there's a couple of links that we've posted in the chat. The first one is to the Africa Citizens Watch platform. If you haven't gone onto it, you can go onto it now, and just to see what we've done and, you know, kind of putting it all together. And then, you know, there were questions about, you know, how you can get involved in sort of civic engagement. We do have online courses that you can take from anywhere in the world, really, but they are tailor-made for African audiences. So we do have a course on civic engagement that you can take at your leisure and interact with the materials that way to teach you sort of the basics on, you know, civic engagement. You can pass it on as well to other audiences that you feel might, if you feel you're well capacitated, you can pass it on to somebody that you feel may not be in the same position. And on that, I would like to say thank you so much for attending today's online regional dialogue on nurturing accountability and on policy implementation. I appreciate that we've gone a few minutes over, and I just want to thank you for your patience. Thank you so much to everybody who's organized this and everybody who's attended. I hope we can stay connected in, you know, in terms of the future dialogues that we're going to have, as Dr. Mrisa said, on this subject. Thank you so much to everyone, and have a good morning.